Good morning. Happy New Year to everyone out there in the world. Welcoming in 2022. We have great things lined up for today and for this year. But first, I want to introduce the lovely Dr. Cheney. Good morning, Dr. Cheney.
Good morning.
And Mr. John Salati. Good morning, Mr. Salati.
Happy Morning, Mr. Phillips.
Yes, Happy New Year to you. You all look great this morning. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too.
Now, I'm going to jump right into the show because I'm so excited about the guests that we have. Now, we're going to go into our usual portion for our law students, our people preparing for the bar. Free speech.
Come in.
We know about free speech. Free speech under the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So what does that mean? That basically means that the United States cannot jail, fine, impose civil liability on people based on what they say or write. But there are exceptions to these rules. Every freedom that we have in this country, there's always exceptions. What sort of exceptions am I talking about? Well, there's something called fighting words. You can't say things that's going to provoke someone to anger to fight you. You can't threaten the president. You can't say things that are not true. These are the exceptions to this beautiful thing that we have called free speech. Now, there's also a part of this law that says that there's a press element, meaning that the press, the media, journalists, reporters, they could freely report. Now, these group of people, they are vitally important to our nation because they function as a watchdog that can investigate and report not only government misconduct, but even private wrongdoing. They are, to a great extent, our eyes and ears. They see and hear things that we cannot see and hear, and then they report it to us. They're very powerful, very important. But as in the Spider-Man movies, with great power comes great responsibility. And what responsibilities does the press have? That brings in our next guest, our first guest for 2022. Our guest today is arguably one of the most prominent investigative journalist authors of all times. Some of the books he's written: Stolen Future, The Untold Story of the 2000 Election, Catch This, Going Deep with the NFL's Sharpest Weapon, Terrell Owens, By Their Works, Profiles of Men of Faith Who Made a Difference, Anyone You Want Me to Be, A True Story of Sex and Death on the Internet. If you haven't made your list of books to read in 2022, jot down some of these books. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, A Season on the Reservation, Legacy of Deception, an investigation of Mark Fuhrman and racism in the LAPD. He's a best-selling author. Shadow on the Mountain is a bestseller. A Death in Wichita is a bestseller. When Men Become Gods is a bestseller. He wrote a book called Talked to Death that was nominated for an Edgar Award and was actually made into the Oliver Stone movie, Talk Radio. He's been on just about every mainstream talk show you can think of: Larry King, Good Morning America, Court TV, Anderson Cooper, the list goes on. We are thrilled and honored to have with us today Mr. Stephen Singler. Good morning, Mr. Singler.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Now, there's so much that we can talk about this morning, but the show is called The Legal Zone, where we tackle injustice. And we would like to talk to you this morning about injustices that could come from the media. Many people, now we have viewers from all over the world, and many people may not know that the media has certain responsibilities. So talk to us, educate us a little bit about what it is that you've done as a reporter and what have you unearthed along the way.
Well, I had written several true crime books prior to the O.J. Simpson case, which started in June 1994. And I was, I'd written about racism and anti-Semitism and things like that, but I think, was somewhat naive in relation to certain parts of law enforcement and how the media functioned. So in 1987, I brought out the book Talk to Death, as you mentioned, and I interviewed a lot of people who were investigating the racists that caused the crimes that are in that book, 245 crimes, 5 murders. And I got to know those people pretty well. And 1994 came around and I was contacted by someone in Los Angeles law enforcement, whom I had known prior because of my investigation into those issues. And I was told that, I had the pretty much conventional view of the O.J. Simpson case. I watched the things on television. I watched the Bronco ride. I sort of jumped to the conclusion that he was likely guilty. And that was, basically what I thought. And this was sort of my deeper education into journalism and into some of the dynamics in American society, particularly around race. And I was given in early August, some pieces of information about the case that were not publicly known at the time. And there were 4 pieces in particular. There would be other information as time went on, but it's important for people to understand the context of what I'm saying in order to talk about the journalism part of it, which comes basically later on. I was given those pieces of information. I contacted Johnny Cochran's office in LA. I eventually got to his second in command, a man named Carl Douglas. And I faxed out those 4 pieces of information to Douglas on August 4th of 1994. And he immediately called me and said, "Where'd you get this information? You got to tell me who your source is." And I said, "I'm not going to do any of that. I'm not going to tell you who my source is. And I will come to Los Angeles and I will sit down with you and talk about this, but I'm not going to give you the information over the phone." There was a lot of resistance, but 4 days later, I was sitting in Robert Shapiro's office in LA.
So he didn't think that you were like just some kook guy that came up with information. He thought he knew you were legitimate.
Well, no, he didn't know I was legitimate, but I was willing to pay to go out there and get a meeting with them. And in the meeting was Douglas, another attorney, and their private investigator at the time, a man named Bill Pavlik, who was very hostile to me and just simply hostile. The 4 pieces of information, this is very detailed, but I think it's important, were that Mark Furman, the detective in the case, had some sort of relationship with Nicole Simpson prior to the crime, beyond having gone to the house in 1987 during a domestic dispute. The second piece of information, and third, was that there was a piece of broken stick and a blue plastic bag that were recovered from Simpson's property. The stick was out by the Bronco. The bag was, if you can go back to the case where Cato Kalin was staying, and there was a chain link fence, and on the other side of the fence was a discarded blue plastic evidence bag, which police carry with them when they go to crime scenes. The 4th piece of information, by far the most important, was that when suspects are taken into custody, as Simpson was on June 13th in the afternoon, blood is drawn, placed in a vial. It's a vial with a purple cap on it. Again, the details are important. It contains something called EDTA, which is a blood preservative, and which keeps the blood soluble so it won't be hardened and dry out. So you can do DNA tests or other tests on it in the future. Simpson's blood was drawn, I believe it was 8 milliliters. And I told them that if they could test the blood samples in this case, some of the blood samples, they would find that it contained this compound within it that would categorically prove that it did not come out of his body on the night of the crime, because we do not naturally have that preservative in our bloodstream, but it came out of this lab. If you know that, you know evidence was planted, you can basically undermine the case, or not, undermine is not the right word, but you can establish that police malfeasance occurred, evidence was planted, and you can go on from there. Douglas and Pavlik categorically told me that I was wrong about everything. There, no relationship with Furman and Nicole, no stick, no bag, no blood. But Douglas, to his credit, as I was leaving the meeting, grabbed my arm, pulled me aside and said, get me some more information. So what happened next, and again, the reason the details are important is because this thing was not reported. The most covered case in American history, the most reporters on it, the most saturated coverage, and you will be surprised at the things that slip through the cracks.
So when you say when you say these things weren't reported, did people actually know about it?
No, that's what I'm saying. When I went to LA, now this is August, this is 7 weeks after the crime. You've had wall-to-wall coverage 24/7 from the moment this happened, as we all know. You've had a preliminary hearing in which Furman made certain critical admissions that were reported on. He said he saw venom at the foot of Ron Goldman, venom being 2 gloves, not 1. That was reported on. What wasn't reported on or known were the mechanisms by which these things happened. So time went on. Douglas investigated what I was saying, again, very much to his credit. And they went to the evidence in LA, found the stick, found the bag, and started to take me a lot more seriously. I was pushing for them to, I said, test the blood, get some blood samples. The prosecution would have, police would have, and test those blood samples. And if you find this substance in them, you can clearly show what happened, to create the probable cause against O.J. Simpson and get him arrested and all of that. And there was a lot of resistance to that. It's very complicated, but I kept pushing, and Douglas and I developed a relationship. And he asked me for more information on a fairly regular basis. I told him, for example, that the story that is known about the case is that at 6 o'clock in the morning, 4 police officers went over to Simpson's property, couldn't get in, jumped the fence. Furman gets rid of the other 3 detectives, goes out, talks to Cato Kalin, and finds the glove. I mean, that's the narrative. But I was told that there was another trip to Rockingham that occurred 3 hours before that, in the middle of the night, where Furman had talked to another officer, and driving over there, they would find evidence, they would solve the case right there. Again, many details, but the woman who worked in the property next to Simpson's, Rosa Lopez, would testify in court that she heard 2 men arguing on Simpson's property at 3 o'clock in the morning because they didn't find any evidence. They went back to the crime scene. Now, the next time they went over there, there was going to be evidence. So the narrative I'm presenting to you is that, Furman realized that they needed something to proceed. He broke a piece of stick off of the fence in the alley behind the condo. He used it to pick up the glove, put the glove in the blue plastic bag, transported the bag and stick over to Simpson's, and discarded both on the item. The glove was found on the sidewalk right by Cato's bungalow, and case closed. Tape goes up around 6:15 in the morning, got our suspect, end of case. So that's the narrative that everybody, is sort of familiar with and knows. And the media, to get to our subject, had already condemned Simpson, had already, we're all over there. I know there were talking heads were going on every night on television saying, he's guilty of this crime, because he took his Bronco ride, et cetera, et cetera. And case closed. And I, was getting a much deeper education into sort of, I think, a deeper view of how things actually work in certain cases. I pushed to get the blood tested in October, and Douglas called me and Cochran, they both called one evening, and they said, will you come to Los Angeles? Will you go into somehow infiltrate the LAPD crime lab and find out what happened there with blood and blood swatches? One of the things I forgot to mention was that 8 milliliters of blood was drawn, as I said, when it was checked in to evidence at Parker Center in LA. Later, 3 or 4 hours after the blood was drawn, there was 6.5 milliliters of blood in there. I think most criminal cases are about evidence. This case, nothing was about evidence. I happen to think evidence is very important in the criminal justice system and due process. So you might start to stack up the facts that I'm giving you, that blood, the amount of blood that was drawn was not the amount of blood that was put into evidence. Then there was a video. Douglas told me at the first meeting, there's no way in the world that blood wasn't checked in right after it's drawn. That's standard operating procedure. If something like that happened, we would know it. Preliminary to the trial unfolded, and we have video of Detective Benet, or one of the 2 senior detectives on the case, with a blood vial in his pocket, going to both crime scenes, going to both Bundy, where the crimes were committed, going to Rockingham with the blood in his pocket. We know that for a fact. We know that he came back with less blood than he left with.
Wow.
Douglas asked me to go to find out something in the crime lab, and I couldn't do it. And he got very rough with me. I was never getting paid. There was no money exchange, nothing like that. I was doing this as a journalist. And he sort of threatened me and said a lot of nasty things. You have to go in there and you have to do this for us, blah, blah, blah.
This is Douglas that did that, that said this?
Yeah. And so I decided that 3 months had passed. I'd given them a lot of information. They had given me nothing. It was a very hardball situation. And I thought I'd done about as much as I could do. I'd paid to go back to Los Angeles, try to go to the crime lab, etc. Couldn't get it done. He said a lot of nasty things, and I went back and I thought, I'm going to write all this up as a book proposal, which is what authors do. And I'm going to submit it to some people, because it was completely counter-narrative to everything that was happening at the time. I mean, we all know that, but you know, that was a very hard thing to go up against. So there was a publisher in Los Angeles that somebody said you should send it to this guy. I wrote it up the last week of October '94, and several days went by, and I called Douglas to give him some more information, and he exploded and slammed down the phone. I'll never talk to you again. Boom.
What was he so upset about?
That they had leaked, the publisher had leaked the book proposal to the defense, the district attorney's office, the New York Times, and other media. So their strategy, what would become part of their strategy as the trial unfolded, because everything I'm telling you of those, you know, at least of those 4 pieces was going to come out in the trial, was in that book proposal. And he felt betrayed. You know, it wouldn't have happened if he had behaved a little differently, but that's what happened. At the time, I thought, you know, this is the worst possible thing. I mean, the information's out there, et cetera, and he'll never speak to me again. So I thought, well, this is bad. The trial started in the last week of January of 1995, and in February, one of the prosecuting attorneys named Rockney Harmon stood up in the courtroom in front of Judge Ito and said, there's this ridiculous assertion out there that blood was planted in this case, and something called EDTA, the preservative, would be found in blood samples. And we're going to disprove that by calling in the FBI to run what is called a gas chromatography test. And so it wasn't, we're going to call in the FBI to see if this is true. We're going to call in the FBI to disprove this crazy idea. Well, guess what? They called in the FBI, they ran the test, and they could not call the FBI as a witness. The witness's name in the case was Special Agent Roger Martz, and they couldn't call him. Now, can you extrapolate a conclusion from that as a lawyer?
So he was never called.
Yes, he was called by the defense.
Okay.
And he testified under oath that they only tested 2 or 3 items. And one was the back gate at the condo. There was photographic evidence taken on probably June 13th. No blood on the gate. There's evidence. Later photographs, there's blood on the gate. So they decided to test that. They decided to test the socks in Simpson's OJ's bedroom. There were socks on the floor. EDTA case, EDTA1 and Delta 5 cases. March testified consistent with stuff, but very scientific stuff. But they, of course, they would call the FBI out on staff, and they would cut all the staff, but they couldn't do it because of information about the relation between Furman and Unholy.
Where there's some distortion.
There's LAPD, Internal Affairs Office. Internal Affairs Investigation.
There's a little distortion in your voice. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
There's a little distortion. It's just
Yeah, testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing.
Is there still distortion? Want me to switch to the other computer? Want me to switch to
Is there distortion now? Is there distortion now?
there's still a little distortion.
There's still a little distortion. Like, what does it sound like here? Does it sound fuzzy or it sounds fuzzy or let me try this other computer.
Yeah, it's like an echo with a little distortion.
I'm opening up the laptop.
I'm gonna mute this one.
Okay,
Okay. Turn off the other one so
Yeah,
the
I'm
feedback
gonna-
will go away.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, hold on. Let me put this one up here. Wait. Just a second.
No problem.
Okay, now see if you can.
Is the volume?
Yeah, the volume's too.
Yeah, the volume is perfect. We just need the video.
Okay, at least I get. Start video right here. Sorry.
There we go.
Okay. Okay, so
So
Wait, the video just went out again.
just a second. See what I'm doing?
There we go.
There.
Perfect.
Okay.
now this computer is not quite as loud as the other one. So if you, and I'm slightly hard of hearing, so if you could all speak up.
How does the sound now?
That sounds perfect.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
And you could hear me pretty good?
Yeah,
All right. Awesome. Okay, so you was telling us about the planted blood,
yeah.
well, seemed to be planted blood. And
Right. So the final piece was that Internal Affairs did an investigation of Furman, and he had told a number of people, according to their records, that he had seen Nicole Simpson's breasts up close and personal. And the whole implication was that they had some sort of relationship apart from what we knew about. In April of 1995, some of this information surfaced in the court, and my participation surfaced. And for a couple of days, I was contacted by 19 major news organizations, so all of the big news organizations in the United States. And I told them this story, and with the details that you have, the blood planting, the stick in the bag, the relationship, the argument at OJ's 3 o'clock in the morning. And the LA Times did a brief piece on it, and a couple of the AP ran a little thing on it. But my point is that all of that information was given to them. All of it implied that there were things about this case that weren't known. They were going to point very much in the direction of police misconduct, the planting of evidence, etc. As we all know, we know a couple of things. We know that in August of '94, that all of the racist tapes that Furman had made with Laura McKinney came out, where he talks about planting evidence, openly using his own blood if he needs to. He talks about beating suspects until his pants are covered with their blood. He talks about being God on the street. A couple months later, OJ's acquitted after 3 hours. The jury has no difficulty deciding his fate. I thought naively that in the aftermath of all of this, because the information I talked about, it all came out in the trial, the stick, the bag, the blood, all of it, I might get a phone call. Some enterprising journalist out there might say, let's see if we can connect these dots. But that didn't happen. It never happened. And every major news organization, I will bet that you folks don't know the story I'm telling you, that you probably never heard any of it, that you don't know what EDTA is, that you don't understand how specific evidence was planted in this case. And I'm giving you my narrative. If you expand it out from that, because I'm not taking credit for certain things here, the timeline in the case never worked. That was discarded as well. We have people walking by the crime scene, a couple that ate dinner that evening at Mezzaluna at 10:30 at night, 10:30 to 10:35. So in the next 20 minutes, Simpson has to kill 2 people, drive across town on a Sunday night when there's heavy traffic, get rid of all the evidence, go inside, clean up, and be ready to go at 10:55.
Now you mentioned some of these news outlets, Geraldo. Once when they had this evidence that you suggested, did they change their tone? Did they say, hey, because I remember I was kind of young back then, but I do remember Geraldo speaking out and having his shows. Was there ever a time he contacted you and maybe apologized for?
The thing that I didn't say is that the case coincided exactly with really the creation of the cable talk TV shows. And they needed content, and this was the greatest content that could ever come their way. So you had this absolute drumbeat virtually around the clock of someone's guilt. And it was based upon, taking a Bronco ride, probably not the best thing to do in those circumstances. But I believe, and I think if people would think about it, they would believe that the criminal justice system we have, designed by incredibly intelligent people who fundamentally understood abuses of power, made it so that evidence is paramount in convicting people. That is a fabulous thing we are all in possession of. And in this case, when that was presented to a jury, I told Douglas in August of '94, it's going to be OJ's DNA. There's no question about it. The DNA thing is not significant. It's where the blood came from. And if you can establish that, their case is going to fall apart. The legal system worked. This is the most maligned jury in the history of juries, primarily a minority jury, put down for all the things that we know. And it's a grave injustice to the people who sat on that jury and watched things fall apart. And the only reason it happened is because Simpson had the resources to fight back, had great lawyers, and he got a little bit of luck with somebody like me who could say things that weren't known within the legal system, or I should say within the defense at that time. So in the 27 or 8 years since the case unfolded, no one has ever, no one in the mainstream media has ever, folks like you who are doing a great job, has ever, tried to actually learn more about this. And my final thing that I'll say is, so why I was given the information was to say, this case will be extremely visible. This is the opportunity to show what happens on a far more widespread basis, especially in minority communities, than is generally known. This is the place to put the spotlight on it because this is going to be so visible. So in addition to having some impact on the Simpson case, that was another reason, okay? What headlines have we seen in the subsequent 27 years over and over and over again? Police violence, police misconduct, the planning of evidence, racism, everything that was in this case and everything that was ignored. And to the extent of embracing Mark Fuhrman, who's a neo-Nazi, or who has neo-Nazi tendencies anyway, the same exact people I was writing about starting in 1984. And that's why I was given the information, because I had done an investigation of racist people who kill. And 10 years later, what I was told was, that those people were living out in the woods. There were about 20 of them. This is inside metropolitan police departments. This is a much bigger disruption to our society than, those people. Those people created some havoc, but it wasn't institutionalized. So this is the opportunity to shine a light on this and bring out some of these activities. And that never happened. Nobody cared about any of that. That was pie in the sky because OJ was guilty. And when the jury found him innocent after 3 hours, which is virtually unheard of, they doubled down. It's the jury's fault. Anyway, that's my story.
And so I want to because based on what you just said, I'm looking here at, this is Geraldo, and they're talking about OJ. And this was in 2006. He's still saying, I think he's a murdering liar. He had all this information that
well, it's better than that. NBC, when my book proposal became known, April of '95,
and that's
NBC sent out an executive who would become a head honcho at the network to Denver, and I gave him all this information, and and they never did anything. Geraldo, if my memory is not failing me, was subsequent to this given a $30 million contract at NBC or MSNBC, or one of them. So you're talking about something pretty big here and pretty ingrained, that the people who succeeded around the Simpson case, media-wise, I don't know anybody who accepted any of the stuff that I'm saying. the people whose careers were made, who made millions and millions of dollars on this, they were all rewarded enormously for ignoring all of this and probably creating a disruption in our society that hurt us racially, maybe legally, I don't know. So it was my initiation into the sort of, here's how you kill journalism, here's how you kill public truth, here's how you kill these things. And there's been a lot of talk in the subsequent quarter century about the dumbing down of America. We've all heard that phrase, the dumbing down. You want a starting point for that? I would suggest this.
Wow. Dr. Cheney, I'm going to get you in really fast because I still have some more questions, but Dr. Cheney, I'm going to unmute you. So you have to unmute yourself, Dr. Cheney. All right. We can hear you now.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Hello there, Mr. Singler.
Hi.
I have prepared a few questions. I have 3, but I can shorten them because you pretty much covered a lot of what I have here. One of the things that I'd like to add a little bit more to is Alan Berg. I remember seeing the photographs under his carport, the aftermath, and I remembered your talk earlier when you talked about the people that were behind all of this. So you're very familiar with racism, let's say. But I want to add this a little bit. Said before he became a talk show host, and we're talking about Alan Berg, he was actually a criminal trial lawyer that went the route of a talk show host. And the other little tidbit I want to add, that he was one of the youngest people to pass the Illinois State Bar at the age of 22. I thought that was just interesting. Now, getting back to what we were talking about. You're familiar with just about everything when we're talking about the criminal court, the terrain of the criminal court, justice and all that. You state in your book, and I have it right here, I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Legacy of Deception. You state in your book that this double murder had everything Americans are obsessed about: glamour, sex, money, fame, sports, and violence. And of course, you also mentioned the OJ drive down the freeway. Here's my question. What do you mean by this? The event was mired down in celebrity overkill, but it was teaching us more about the legal system and constitutional law than most people ever imagined learning. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think by that point in my life, I had sat through 4 or 5 or 6 criminal trials.
Mm-hmm.
And you learn things. So, most people don't know very much about how court systems work, due process, all of those things. I mean, people my age grew up watching Perry Mason, and then that evolved to CSI, and, everything's resolved in 43 minutes. And it's a very simplistic view of that stuff. So, I mean, this was on television every day. This was in the courtroom. This was showing how lawyers argue in front of judges and how judges rule and how jurors are, the process of jury selection. This was showing how motions get filed and what the motions mean and how you try to stop certain motions and how you try to stop certain procedures. So, the irony is that we could have learned. This was such a learning moment. It could have been such a learning experience for how our system actually works and how it's designed to work. And it was just completely interpreted the other way. The system failed us,
Okay.
because the jurors were flawed.
Okay.
I mean, that's the shame of it, that we should have gone deeper. I mean, a couple of you are lawyers, I believe. Chris Darden wrote in his book, prosecutor Chris Darden, one of the leading prosecutors, wrote a book called In Contempt. And if you're interested in going a little deeper here, on page 174 to 178 in the hardcover version, he writes about my involvement in the case and how he got the book proposal. And the first thing he says is, if what Singular was writing is true, then this is Brady material. Brady material meaning you would have to dismiss the case. But he never writes anything else about it, which means that once the FBI ran their tests, once they found that the evidence was tainted, that's Brady material. That case could have been stopped right there, and somebody said, what in the world actually went on here? What's the connection between Mr. Benet drawing this blood, putting it in his pocket, going to both crime scenes and coming back with less blood? It's right there in front of people. And that's what I said in late April of 95. I was telling the AP, the LA Times, the New York Times, the networks, all of it. And I got my own education into, once you set a narrative in place, it's virtually impossible to change it.
That's so mind-blowing to me that information was out and the people like Geraldo never said anything.
No, I mean, I was on a show a couple of times and I tried to talk about some of these things. You only get about 4 minutes, so it's hard to put it in the context of what actually happened. People don't know that the FBI was called into this case for a very specific purpose, to disprove an allegation. Once you establish that that's not what happened, the entire narrative falls apart. And so you have, one other thing that, so LAPD goes, Furman's a bad apple, no doubt about it. There's one rotten apple in the barrel, and we're going to get rid of him. And they got rid of him. And just as a side note, the murder weapon that killed Alan Berg was owned by a man named Gary Yarborough, who was in the order who killed Berg and these other people. He lived in Sandpoint, Idaho, which was a known enclave for white supremacists. When Furman retired from the LAPD, you want to take a guess where he moved?
Idaho.
He moved to Sandpoint, Idaho. So the LAPD's take on the whole thing was, there's one rotten apple. 3 years later, there was something called the Rampart scandal in Los Angeles. Rampart's a division in the LAPD, and it blew up, where you had a whole division involved in evidence planning, violence, beating people, falsifying arrests. I mean, I wrote a book about it called The Uncivil War came out in 2001. Not many people read it because I was connecting the dots of, this isn't one bad apple. This isn't one isolated incident. This is something that was effectively sanctioned by the LAPD and various divisions over numerous years. And again, we have come a distance, I think, in this issue with the murders of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and
George Floyd,
Tavon. We've gotten it out more in the open, where these kinds of things really do go on, and they really do have a horrible impact on communities, and they've got to be cleaned up, and et cetera, et cetera. So, I wish it had happened in 1995 when Simpson was acquitted, but things don't really work like that. So it's, this information has effectively been suppressed. Not by some grand conspiracy, but just because of the way people take in the news, jump to conclusions, and the way we reward people at the highest levels of our media for defiling the very principles that we claim to believe in.
Wow.
Any of
I,
us
Dr. Kinney,
arrested
go ahead.
for
I,
anything would
mm,
like due process.
Yeah.
okay. I just have, you pretty much, again, you've gone over it. I was interested in the comments that were made about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights on page 73, where your source or your deep throat or your informant actually says to you or suggests to you to buy a copy of the U.S. Constitution and read the Bill of Rights. And he's talking about what you all have already covered about the violations that were done. For example, 4 policemen jumped the fence without a search warrant. The TV cameras covering OJ's facial expressions and basically deeming him, the commentators and the media deeming him guilty. And you go on with that.
Time magazine darkening his
Mhm.
face on the cover.
Yeah, I remember
Remember that one?
Yeah, remember that. So I was basically, I think you've already answered this. You say that you're very concerned about these violations because if unchecked, could erode the rules that we live by. And if they were to happen, some of our most basic freedoms could no longer be executed. And so I was basically asking you, what are your thoughts about law enforcement? You've already told us journalism and the fake journalism, what we hear all the time, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Is society in a better place today? I guess I could answer that. No.
That's a tough question. I think all of these things, I think public truth through journalism and maybe other mechanisms can give us some common ground to stand on. I think back to Watergate, there were
Mhm.
Republicans in Congress saying, Frank Church was one of them from Idaho, I believe, saying we're going to clean this mess up. There was a commonality about something went wrong here and we're going to try to correct it. And I think some good measures, steps were taken. All this does is divide a society.
Yeah.
I mean, all if you don't have the truth and accept it in some way, and we have the perfect example from last January 6th, where people just embrace a complete delusion and are willing to take violent steps to defend their delusion. Very similar to what Mark Furman did, by the way. I have no doubt that he felt that he was doing this to convict a guilty man. I don't doubt that at all. That's not his job.
Right.
That's where you cross the line and you're doing something that's against all of the principles. So our society continues to be more and more divided. And I think that, if journalism could play a constructive role in establishing some sort of public truth that we could all agree upon, and then move forward from there, a very complicated thing. The problem is that you have networks now in place, cable networks, whose entire job is to not promote that, not to promote any form of unity, not to promote any form of common ground.
Wow.
Their agenda is exactly the opposite. They have numbers crunchers who pull out numbers who say this is who we're going to appeal to and this is how we're going to do it. And it's totally destructive. So you have a third of, we can't agree on getting a vaccine for a worldwide illness that's killing people every day.
Right.
We can't agree on it. I mean, that's not the Simpson case. That's something else, and so there's never a simple answer to that question. In some ways,
Okay.
I think we've made a lot of progress as a society. I think we're much more diverse and there are more opportunities, but we have a long way to go. So.
Okay.
I want to
Okay,
get
Steve. I
get-
need one more from Steve. I've got to do this one.
All right, go ahead.
Steve, You did something here that, well, you see what I'm going to say to you. I'm talking about your observation, and it has to do with race, prosecution, and defense court room interaction, or you could say swagger or whatever. You described the observation of the prosecutor, Deputy Chris Darden, being masterfully baited over and over again by the defense attorney, Johnny Cochran. You state that Chris, an African American, was using his education, his intelligence, intuition, street smarts, and everything else at his disposal to convict a very prominent member of the African American community. I'm talking about OJ. You're talking about OJ. And a police officer Chris was defending had several years earlier told a woman, and we all know about that tape that came out, he wanted to burn Black people everywhere. Talking about Mark Fuhrman. You state you were reminded of how Muhammad Ali fought certain boxers, Sonny Liston, Floyd Patterson, and other less gifted Black boxers in the 1960s and the 70s, and how Ali understood the damage that racism had done to these men, understood it so deeply and so well that he knew precisely how to undermine their confidence by stressing he had more racial pride and he was more loved by his people, etc., than these boxers were, which reduced them to mediocre opponents who could easily be dominated before they ever stepped into the ring with him. Why do you think these opponent strategies, that's my connection here, used by Cochran and Muhammad Ali were winning strategies for them? I just thought this was just so interesting.
And before you answer that, that's taken directly from the book Legacy of Deception, right?
Yes.
Okay, because that's beautiful.
Page 193.
I want all our listeners to go get the book Legacy of Deception, an investigation of Mark Fuhrman and racism in the LAPD. Dr. Cheney just read from a page from that book. Okay, go ahead, Steve.
Well, I think, I mean, it's a complex question, but Ali just was not going to be controlled by the forces that had, so controlled, Black people through the experience of racism for 400 years. I mean, that was his, and that level of confidence, that level of knowing who he was, was just an incredibly powerful psychological tool. I mean, Sonny Liston, in and out of prison, and Floyd Patterson was a good guy, but he was living in the past. He was living in a past mentality and a past psychology, and and Ali just saw through all of that. He would, while he was in the ring with several of the opponents, all of them are African American, he would say, "What's my name?" He'd hit them. He'd say, "What's?" They were all saying, "Your Cassius Clay," and et cetera, et cetera. Boom. What's my name? I mean, he didn't just the Patterson fight, by the way, he could have knocked him out in any of the earlier middle rounds, but he didn't do it. He carried him to the end of the fight so he could keep beating him up and humiliating him. And I mean, there was a symbolic death, just saying this is over. And I'm going. I mean, he didn't only revolutionize, how Black athletes behave. He revolutionized how all athletes behave, because they were all very polite and followed the script and did all of that. And I mean, he just came in and he shattered it, with a couple of fights.
And you said that you felt kind of sorry for Chris Darden, the way Johnny Cochran was working him overtime.
Yeah, I mean, he was in a tough position,
Yeah.
He was having to, I know some people who have done a lot of research in the Simpson case and some other areas for mine, and they're African American, and one of them, who's a doctor, almost got into a fist fight with Darden at a public occasion because of these same dynamics. They're saying, how can you defend the guy who wants to round up all African Americans and burn them. How can you defend genocide? How can you? I mean, that's a tough position. And how many out there in the DA's office? Well, I will tell you that in the internal affairs investigation that was done at Furman in '95, several um, uh, assistant DAs came forward and said, "You can't trust any of this evidence. You anything that this guy collected." And they were in the DA's office, and Marshall Clark, the other leading DA, just got rid of them. So I mean, they had warning after warning after warning before the trial started, in addition to the information that I brought, and in addition to the racist things they were uncovering about Furman, and they ignored it all. And so, when it blew up in their face, it would have been nice for one person. There were a couple of people who tried, but to say, you know what, maybe we got this wrong. Blame the jury.
Yeah, and still today, John, I
Blame
want
the
to get
jury.
you in, John, before we go. But I just want to read this because this just blows my mind. This was a 2019 for our younger audience. This is something that you would know. And again, this is Geraldo. When I try to assess why he has managed talking about OJ to hoodwink so many for so long, I've come to the conclusion that many really don't care if he committed the murders. And they're still not mentioning what you just mentioned to us today. It's just mind-blowing to me. John, go ahead and jump in.
Well, a couple of things have come to mind, but trying to short circuit this here. Steve, you've raised all of these issues. Can you offer a perspective maybe on motive? That is, your perspective is of the media. And so you say, well, we had all this information and all of these media outlets had all this information, and yet they chose to ignore it. But what I'm asking you to kind of, I guess, speculate why. I mean, all right, you talked about Geraldo, he's going to get a lot of money, but even that, it's like, but why? What's behind all of that to say, why are they willing to ignore what appears to be really damning information?
Well, I don't have a complete answer to that question. After Simpson was acquitted, I went back to LA. I met with a reporter for Time magazine, and we met face to face, and I tried to talk about some of these things, and it was impossible. So this is an answer that's coming in from the side, and I talk about this sometimes, but I grew up very much in the shadow of World War II. My father was a bombardier pilot over Germany, and he was shot down and was a POW in Germany for a year. And it was the sort of formative experience of my growing up, because he had PTSD before people talked about that. And so I grew up with basically a question in my mind: how did those things happen? How does a population embrace hatred and violence and all that? And I had that question until this happened. And then I understood that propaganda works. It works on not very smart people. It works on smart people. It works on liberals. It works on conservatives. It's an emotional reality more in some ways than it's a political reality. And the constant propaganda, and that's all it is, that's people going on television with opinions. We entered the age of opinions, and we left behind the age of journalism. And it happened right then. You can't pump this into people day after day after day without it having an effect, probably on our central nervous system, probably on our biology, probably on how we're wired, probably on how we think that we perceive the world. And when you've seen an image time after time after time, the Bronco chase being thousands of times, you know, I think it's down at that level. Because to then have your narrative disrupted questions your identity. I think this goes way beyond criminal justice and all that. I think it goes down to the depths of how we perceive reality, how we operate as people. And there's a certain point where that door closes and nothing else can enter. And this was the biggest, clearest example of it that could happen, coinciding with the creation of a new technology, a society-altering technology as the internet would be a few years later, where the mechanisms that had been in place, if I go back to the Allen Berg case, 25 defendants, highly complicated case, 240 crimes. Everything about that case worked appropriately. Everything. And bad people came into the courtroom and were convicted and put away mostly forever. The system worked. There was no media overblowing things. There was talk radio then, but there wasn't talk television. There wasn't cable TV. There wasn't anything like that. This was the pivotal moment, the pivotal opportunity to learn something about our society and our legal system and our media and our law enforcement. And I know very bright, very liberal, very high-minded people whom I could never have this discussion with, ever. Ever. Jeffrey Toobin wrote about this in the New Yorker, became a CNN legal analyst. They did a program on OJ, 20th anniversary, whatever. And his response to this was, because I thought he was guilty, I thought everyone else thought he was guilty. This is a lawyer. This is somebody saying, my experience as a Harvard graduate, as a fabulously successful, wealthy CNN commentator, is the same as the people living in Compton and everywhere else in the United States.
Really not the people.
This stuff doesn't go on. This doesn't happen. That's a level of denial that's absolutely stunning. I mean, so I think the answer to your question is, I think it goes so deep into how we take in information now, how these narratives are established in one case after another, how they're set in stone by a series of images, that everything that comes after that is almost dismissed, unless you really have a serious
It's almost the mechanism Hitler used with the propaganda. And he talks about it in his book, just flood people with the same short message until their thinking is changed. And then you got them.
But the question that, okay, but there's a part of me that wants to say, all that is possible if those images and those messages are playing to the some underlying either desire or belief on the part of the viewer or listener. In other words, why this whole thing with OJ?
It's the perfect narrative. It hits the deepest racist impulses in the culture. It hits at the very heart of, it hits that from the very, and it, we can be brutally honest about this or not, but, I grew up in rural Kansas. I know something about racism. I lived through that. And it appeals to the deepest racist impulses that are there. And that's the sellable narrative. That is what can be sold, packaged, bought, and sold. That's why you take the world's most famous news magazine and you have to darken the man's face to make him look guiltier, because he, got with the white woman, and then look what he did.
Wow.
He got the beautiful white woman,
It's a
We let him do that. We let
400-year-old
him be a
truth.
star. We put him on television. We did everything. He got the white woman. I mean, this is as basic as it gets. And then look what happened.
And this is how he repays us. I mean, it is a 400, 500-year-old trope at this stage.
It's the saleable narrative. That's what sells. And it's simple. It's clean.
And we've
There are
seen
no
it for the last
complications.
5 years, right? The last 5 years.
I just told you the narrative in 2 sentences.
Yeah.
And it deepens those racial prejudices. That's what it does.
And the media
And
and the injustice of it all is the media flames these passions by disseminating information that may not be true, but with the intent to do just that, inflame biases that are already present in people.
and ignoring everything else.
Ignoring everything else.
And what's the root of ignore? Ignorance. I mean, it's 27 years later, nothing's ever penetrated it. Where we could actually learn something from this event.
Yeah.
If you had told me, because when I got this information in early August of 1994, I said that this will never go anywhere. Nobody's going to listen to me. That's never going to happen. I'm sitting in Denver, 1,200 miles away from it. This is a pipe dream. I said, I'll make one phone call to Robert Shapiro's office, and then I made a couple more, and it went forward, and all these things happened. But if you told me that all of this information would get into the legal system, would play itself out in the trial, and would be a part of his acquittal, and then nobody would pay any attention to it, I wouldn't have believed it.
Did
I
OJ
didn't
ever reach out
realize
to
how
Did OJ ever
deep-
reach out to you and thank you?
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
No. There was an article in the LA Times in 96, I think. And the book they had a picture of the book on his coffee table or something. But no, I think, that's a whole other story, but I think he knows what happened in the case. I think he was afraid. And I can understand that.
We can go on and on for days, but our time is up. Thank you so much. But this is not the last we're going to see of you. Next week,
Right.
Stephen and his wife. Wife is
Joyce will
also
be here
an
next
author.
week.
And we're going to
A
talk
singular twofer.
about religion and violence. You don't want to miss that. Yes. So thank you again,
Thank you.
Steve.
Thank
and
you
we
for
will
having me.
see you again next week.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All righty.
I appreciate it.
All right. Wow. So, I'm still blown away by Geraldo. I'm sorry. Because this guy comes out and he speaks as though he knows nothing of all this evidence, even though this happened years ago. And I know a lot of our viewers, they know about it, but they don't know it. They didn't live it like some of us lived it. It's just amazing that the media, and we could group them all together because he said there were 19 major news avenues that had this and sat on it. And as John, you asked, you said, well, why? Why sit on it? With the intent to actually divide people? Is that what we're coming to now?
Well, I don't think that's anything new, frankly. There's always been a streak of that. You can go back to the Hearst newspapers. You can go back to the beginning when newspapers were really rags in a lot of ways, the 18th century. So it's not new, but the fact that they would all ignore this, because it undermined the underlying narrative.
And this gets so deep. And I mean, I don't think that we just barely touched on it, but I want to share this because Hitler, again, and I was able to pull it up, and we know what he did, how he was able to brainwash thousands of individuals to jump on his bandwagon. He says in Mein Kampf, and John, you could tell us what that means because you have that German background. What's Mein Kampf?
My struggle.
Yes. That to achieve its purpose, propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan. This is how you brainwash people. And the media has become an outlet to brainwash people without even thinking, they don't even know why they think the man's guilty. It's just because things been pumped into their ears over and over and over and over again.
But again, I'm going to stress it's because on some level, they want to believe it.
Wow.
You know, yeah, he's right. Hitler is right. I mean, Hitler could have worked, he could have been a madman. You know, he could have been on an advertising executive. You're right. Keep it simple and keep saying it again and again. That's what commercials are about.
Right.
But again, on some level, it's because underneath the advertising executive understands you either want this or you want to believe this. You know, it's playing to some insecurity, particularly, let's say, advertising to women. You know, you're playing to some insecurity and you harp on it and you harp on it and you harp on it. But it's because it's playing to some underlying psychology. And
So
that's what's insidious about what Steve is talking about.
And so when we talk about injustice, the media now, who, by the way, the media has special laws. Every state and the government has special laws to protect the media, because the idea is that the media should be free to disclose this information that other people can't get, right? So there are specific laws in place to protect them. But now we see them doing things like this. Who's going to protect us from them? All
Well,
right.
that would have been my follow-up question to Steve. It would be, if we're trying to, shall we say, in the phraseology, educate our consumers, the people who watch this show, okay, how should you perceive what you're hearing, what you're reading from the media, whatever the sources? Because there is a question.
How can you
of,
decipher what's true and what's not? Now, everyone who's watching, know that you have your own responsibility to don't take everything that you hear as golden, as true. You can't. Dr.
Well,
Channing, I guess you have the
it
last
says
word.
we have to be aware of our own biases, right?
Well,
All
some
this
people
stuff with
are not.
vaccines and
Some-
COVID and all
Right.
that. It's all playing to, well, you know, I have certain biases either for or against authority figures, for or against science, for or against various
Yeah, but
things.
John, so many people are not even aware of their biases. They've grown
Well,
up
so, I
in
mean, we
homes and
have
they've
to be
heard
aware of
things,
them. Yeah.
and these things are planted in their subconscious. They don't even know it. Dr. Channing, I'm going to give you the last word.
In the media, what we're talking about is agenda setting. The other thing, as far as broadening one's horizon, we have to take in various sources. We can't just rely on one particular source.
Yes.
I think about the O.J. Simpson trial. I think about how I was so addicted to what was going on, meaning what we saw on TV. Then it got to a point that we didn't get enough information. So instead of sticking with what we were hearing, I started going to the tabloids, you know, the yellow journalism, trying to find out what was really going on. So some of us may do that and some of us may not do that. I had somebody else, we all went to Howard University, and we were just dying for information about this case. And eventually I found Legacy of Deception because I was just desperate to find out what I was trying to find out. I have not a clue, but I was trying to find out. and most people were saying this and that. So we search other sources, one of the
All right.
ways.
Thank you both for such a riveting show, and I look forward to next week when we
Yep.
have Steve's wife on with us. Happy New Year again to you all.
Thank you. Same to you.
Yes,
Don't
thank
forget to
you. Happy New
subscribe to
Year.
the subscribe to the channel, the little red button below, and hit on the bell that would notify you when new shows come out. All right, everyone, take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching our video. For experienced legal services in Washington, D.C., Alabama, and Washington State, visit our website at remislaw.com or call us at 1-833-329-1799.
When someone goes through a divorce, they lose their best friend. They lose their house. They lose their children. Any time away from your child is a loss. Let's face it, divorce kills. The average cost in the United States for a divorce is $13,000. It's not uncommon for divorce to cost well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. At Remus, we take into consideration you, the divorcing spouse, your property, your money, and your children. We assist clients in directing them to therapy, mentorship programs, savings. We mitigate the cost of divorce to keep your expenses down. We look out for the client holistically.
I came to Remus Law seeking a divorce. Salon listened to me. I told him my story. When he mailed me a copy of the complaint, which summarized my story, he was able to say exactly what I had been feeling for so many years. When my husband was served with the complaint, he came to me with tears in his eyes. He said he didn't know this is how I was really feeling. He asked if we could try again.
At Remus, we do all that we can for our clients.
Wait a little bit longer. Wait a little, we'll be coming around again. 'Cause you know we're stronger than we were when you and I began. I don't know what's harder, holding on or letting go. I don't know if we oughta, know if we oughta, know I know. I don't know where we're going, but I know it's gonna be good. I don't know where we're going, but I know it's gonna be good.
The lessons taught in the adventures of Uncle Billy and Ross are lessons that adults learn late in life. Some never learn it. I will recommend every parent, every young person, every adult read this book. But more importantly, apply the lessons.